and welcome back. In the last chapter, we witnessed the peaceful transference of political power from one political party to another in the United States. We also saw the United States more than double its size with a mega real estate deal with France known as the Louisiana Purchase. And we also felt the United States being pressured between two warring nations, Britain and France. And we're going to see today how that pressure intensifies into the War of 1812. This is to be the first in a four-part lecture series. So without further delay, ladies and gentlemen, or I should say ladies, excuse me, let's get into Chapter 9, Redefining the Nation, 1809 to 1832. I think when we talk about the War of 1812, a lot of Americans don't really know anything about it. If I was to mention the War of 1812 to you, hopefully you've read the chapter. If you haven't, I think the only thing that you could really tell me is the burning down of the White House. So again, not many Americans are familiar with this war, but don't feel bad. If I was to go to England and ask your counterparts what they remember about the War of 1812, or what they know about it, I should say, they themselves couldn't really say much about it. So they could only say probably about the wars fighting Napoleon. So again, it's a war that's not really remembered too well in the United States or in Great Britain. But if I were to go to Canada and ask your counterparts there, they could reel off all kinds of dates, facts, you name it. For the Canadians, this is what the revolution is to us Americans here in the United States. And what we're going to witness is it's really going to strengthen Canadian nationalism. But what about this war? I'm sure you've read it, and you need some explanation in it. What is going on? And that's where I'm here to help. So let's get into this chapter 9. So let's talk about conflicts at home and abroad. What we see is, during the next presidential election, James Madison easily wins an easy victory for president. And he had been pretty much Thomas Jefferson's right-hand man. And if you remember through our lectures, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are pretty much together the whole time. He became Jefferson's Secretary of State, and some would say that Madison even had a kind of a better mind than what Jefferson did. And if there was any one man at this time who had the credentials to be a great president, it seemed, it was James Madison. He had been a veteran of the Revolution. If you remember when we talked about the Constitution, he was the father of the Constitution. He was from Virginia. And so far, all of our presidents except one, John Adams, has been from Virginia. He had a very calm demeanor. He had apparently a great sense of humor, and he was well prepared on any issue. So what we're seeing now is Madison comes in as now the next president of the United States, and he's finding himself in the same situation that Jefferson found himself in between the warring nations of Britain and France. And as you remember, both Britain and France are messing with our shipping. Britain is pulling our sailors off the ship and forcing them into the British Navy to fight France. So Madison's looking at this, and really he can't really offer any better solutions than what Thomas Jefferson could offer. However, what we see is Madison comes up with something known as Bacon's Bill Number 2. And what this did is it lifted the trade restrictions on both Britain and France. And what it stated was if Britain and France continued to mess with our shipping, the restrictions would go back on those nations once again. Or I should say whatever nation continued to harass our shipping. France really didn't have anything to lose in this. It didn't really have a great navy like Great Britain. So Napoleon makes it clear that he won't be messing with American shipping anymore. So the trade restriction is lifted off France. However, Great Britain really doesn't take any notice whatsoever. So the trade restriction on Great Britain remains intact. So what we see is by the spring of 1812, that embargo is still reimposed on Great Britain, and in Congress itself, there's a new group asserting its dominance, and they're known as the War Hawks. The War Hawks were really that generation that came of age after the Revolution, and they're very ardent nationalists, and what they're seeing Great Britain doing to us is slaps in the face, insults, and they're demanding that we should do something in return for this. The War Hawks also are calling for a war with Great Britain because they're very eager to take Canada and also Florida. If you remember, Americans have always had a strange fascination with Canada. We always think Canadians want to be Americans, but they don't. And what we also are interested in, like I said, is Florida. Now, why Florida? Well, Florida is owned by Spain at this time, which is an ally of Great Britain. And why a lot of people, especially in the South, are eager to get their hands on Florida is because Florida is serving as a refuge for runaway slaves. So thousands of slaves are running into Florida off southern plantations, and they want to take Florida to get those slaves back. So again, these war hawks, people like, as you can see, oh, excuse me one second. I forgot about this slide right here. I know my video right here is kind of obscuring James Madison. This is James and Dolly Madison. I should actually kind of go back to this 1 second. James Madison, James Madison brings into the White House his wife. A wife hadn't really been in the White House for the last 8 years. Jefferson himself was a widower. So bringing Dolly Madison in was kind of like a breath of fresh air for the White House, and Dolly Madison sets up a lot of protocols that are still in effect in the White House today. She's young, she's vivacious, she adds a certain sparkle to James Madison in his life, and again, influences those around James. They talk about her vivaciousness and her great sense of humor. She was known for also chewing tobacco. So Dolly had kind of that same kind of body sense of humor that James Madison did. And they were known for having great dinner parties throughout Washington. Everybody loved to come to these parties in which kind of the newest delicacies of the day were being served. One, in turn, was actually ice cream. And Dolly had a certain favorite flavor. And this would be the part when I ask you to guess which flavor it would be if we were actually in a class lecture. And you'd probably say things like chocolate, vanilla, pistachio, and these other kind of strange flavors. Her favorite flavor, so history tells us, was actually oyster, believe it or not. So while she's chewing tobacco, she's chugging down that oyster ice cream. Yum. When I was talking to you just a while ago about the war hawks, these were the two kind of leading war hawks in Congress at the time. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina and Henry Clay from Kentucky. So these guys are among the leaders and movers and shakers in Congress with these war hawks. And what we're going to see is they're going to be with us pretty much for the rest of the semester. And in the beginning, they're young art nationalists. But what we're going to see, especially with John C. Calhoun, as time goes on, they're going to go from being art nationalists to art sectionalists. Sectionalists being that area of the country that they're from. What we're seeing is, at the same time that the U.S. is experiencing these kind of ruining international relations with Great Britain, it's coming at the same time that our relations with Indians are starting to fall apart within the United States. So what we see is, if we kind of go back to the previous administration with Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson had actually been in favor of actually dumping the Indians on the other side of the Mississippi River. And with the buying of the Louisiana Territory, this was going to make this possible now. And he was always in favor of, how can I put it, trying to civilize these Indians. He had actually encouraged moneylenders to go in and try to lend money to these Indians. And you're thinking, well, why would they do that? Well, to get a loan, you have to put down collateral, and the only thing that these Indians could offer was the land itself. And of course, if they got into financial difficulty and actually couldn't make the loan payment back, they would lose their land. In turn, meaning their land would be sold and they would be forced off of it. So at the same time, Jefferson is encouraging this uplifting of these people to civilize them and try to trick them out of their land. He's still continuing Washington's policy of promoting settled farming among these Indians. So many of these Indians are settling down, they're owning slaves. The expansion of slavery is encouraged among these people. So again, Indian relations themselves are not really proceeding too well. By the time we get into the 19th century, the 1800s, there's over 400,000 Americans that have settled west of the Appalachian Mountains. This settlement dwarfs the remaining Indian tribes that are in these areas. And with this greater revel of all these white settlers, a lot of these Indian tribes are having to rethink about, assimilation, about how should they adopt white ways, should they not. And so what we see is many are adopting white ways. They're establishing businesses, they're becoming traders, slave owners, farmers. However, not all Indians are participating in this. There's groups known as nativists, those who want to reject these white ways to get back to the way things were before the arrival of the whites. And this really coincides with a period in Native American history known as the Age of Prophecy that lasts from 1800 to 1812. What this really was movements to revitalize Indian culture among the Creeks, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, and other tribes. Some leaders, like the Seneca chief Handsome Lake, was calling for autonomy from whites, but not with rejecting all white ways. And he's saying that they should take up farming. And Handsome Lake himself was an Indian chief who had overcame addiction to alcohol and said that, again, Indians needed to give up gambling, fighting, sexual promiscuity, and again, settle down, adopt farming. But that didn't mean that they had to reject all white ways. And actually, this is a picture right here of Handsome Lake. Sorry. But while some Indians are calling for peaceful coexistence, there are other Indians who are rejecting this. Two prominent Indians who are doing this are the Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tincanawan. They're preaching a more militant message, and what they want is separation from whites, revival of Indian culture, and a resistance to federal policy. So Tecumseh, pictured here on the left, and yes, I know my picture's probably blocking it, but you can see it on the free slides in Blackboard. He's traveling up and down the Mississippi River Valley, and he's trying to revive those old Indian alliances of the 1760s. And what Tecumseh is really saying is, all Indians are a single people. They're not different tribes. They have to unite to resist the encroaching effects of whites. His brother, Tincanawan, sees himself as being a prophet, a holy man, and again, he's preaching the rejection of whites and their ways. Excuse me. By 1810, Tecumseh is calling for pretty much attacks on white settlements. He's trying to recruit as many Indians still to achieve this. But what happens is there is a preemptive strike by the United States in November 7th, 1811 at Prophetstown in Indiana, where Tincanawan had his actual little settlement set up. And American forces under William Henry Harrison, about 1,000 soldiers, walk in and they pretty much massacre everyone in the village. Here on the left is William Henry Harrison. He'll become famous with this battle, the Battle of Tippecanoe, in which, again, Indian inhabitants of Prophetstown are pretty much massacred. William Henry Harrison will use this battle as the slogan for his coming presidential campaign later in our lecture series. He'll be known as Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So again, this is one of the kind of seminal moments in U.S. history. If you've ever heard the, again, slogan Tippecanoe and Tyler too, this is where this actually comes from. All right, let's talk now about war erupting with Great Britain. Madison himself doesn't want to become a war president. He hates war, but he's found, due to events, he's going to have to engage in it. And what we're seeing is Americans are still dealing with these constant attacks on their shipping by Great Britain. Nothing that the United States has done has seemed to really work. And so with this is now more reports coming in that Britain is actually encouraging Indian unrest out west. So pretty much enough is enough. We've been pushed as far as we can, and so James Madison finds that in June of 1812 he has to ask for a declaration of war by Congress with Great Britain. And what we see really is not everyone in America is really behind this. States north of New Jersey really vote against the war, and south and in the west they vote for it. Now, why is everything New Jersey northward voting against the war? Well, remember, this is the Northeast and also kind of New England, and how they're making their living is by shipping and by this constant trade restrictions that's been placed on them. And now this war, their way of life is pretty much dying. And when we were talking about the trade embargoes with Jefferson, now Madison, a lot of people in those areas were simply ignoring this and flouting U.S. law. So again, this is not popular in the Northeast. What we see is this is really the first time we declare war on a European nation, and we were totally unprepared to go to war. Britain itself had 1,000 naval ships. We had about 20. They have battle-hardened veterans that have been fighting really, up almost for 20 years, and we have still kind of local militia and kind of green soldiers that haven't really ever fought a war. So, again, the odds are heavily stacked against us. One of the things that even stacks the decks against us even harder is the Bank of the United States. If you remember, it was given a charter, a 20-year charter, and it was expiring in 1811. Well, the charter was expired, and what we saw is there's no more Bank of the United States, so there was not going to be any loans for the supporting of this war. And what we see is northern merchants and bankers, again, are not in favor of this war because it's affecting their profits, so they're not going to lend out any money to the government for this. Again, we have hardly anything of a military. And in the beginning, we don't have really much to worry after we declare war because Britain is still engaging in fighting Napoleon in Europe. But while the Britons have their backs turned, we launched 2 attacks directly into Canada in an attempt to take Canada from Britain. And what we find is we think it's going to be an easy kind of fight going in, and what it turns out to be is far from the truth. If you remember when we were talking about the end of the Revolutionary War, many loyalists, about 60,000 to 100,000 of Americans, picked up and moved to Canada. And these were people who had been loyal to Great Britain, those Tories, who had bitter memories about Americans in the Revolutionary War and their property being seized and them being persecuted. They go to Canada, and the effect was it's going to make Canada ultra loyal to Britain for many decades to come. Well, many of these Canadians still have those bitter memories, and they're resisting the Americans as hard as they can. While their Americans kind of make a mess of things, they burn down public buildings, and they're forced to retreat back into the United States. What we're seeing is, by 1814, Napoleon has been defeated at the Battle of the League of Nations. And Britain now has turned its full attention to the United States. And for Britain sees this as being kind of a stab in the back, that while they were trying to fight this French tyrant in Europe, America was kind of stabbing it in the back, and now they're going to strike back. And boy, does Britain strike back. In 1814, what we see is the British actually descend upon Washington. Outside of Washington, there is a small little battle known as the Battle of Bladesburg, but it also goes by another name. U.S. forces do meet British forces at this battle, but they fire once, throw down their guns, and run into the woods, with the British chasing behind them. More Britons actually die of heat exhaustion trying to chase U.S. soldiers than actually being shot and killed in this battle. It's known as the Races of Bladesburg. So, with Washington pretty much now undefended, the British march in, and remembering what they've done in Canada, they set about burning Washington to the ground. As the British actually march in, one resident of Washington, D.C. said, "If George Washington had been here, you would have never made it in." To which the British commander replied, "If George Washington had been here, he would have never left his capital undefended." So as I told you, the British are marching in. James Madison is not there. He'd actually gone out to actually witness the battle, and with U.S. forces running into the woods, he himself is just outside of Washington trying to find his way around. It was kind of similar to what happened in 9/11 when no one was sure where the President George W. Bush was at the time. He was kind of here and there. So again, it was kind of a similar situation. Dolly Madison actually expected the U.S. forces to make a quick victory. She'd actually laid out the table for James as he was coming home, and what she heard was that the British were actually coming. So what she does is she actually orders the picture on the left, this famous portrait of Washington, to actually be taken down and saved because she didn't want the British to actually burn this. And she found a copy of the Declaration of Independence, took that out of the drawer, and made their way out of the White House. The British themselves will come in, see the table laid out for dinner, actually enjoy having the dinner. Then they go around the White House and into the private rooms of James and Dolly Madison, poke around, steal some things, and then they proceed to burn the White House down to the ground. Here on the left is the gutted remains of the executive mansion, what will become known as the White House. And actually, the British also hold a mock kind of vote in the U.S. Capitol building about who wanted to actually burn the building down. And they took a vote, and you can see the results of it. They all voted to burn down the U.S. Capitol. So there is the remains of our Capitol building, Congress and the Senate. So you're probably saying, well, Mr. Hins, America doesn't lose a war. Surely there were some kind of victories for us against Britain? Well, there were. What we saw was the USS Constitution. If you've ever heard this boat, it's called Old Ironsides. It actually defeated the British battleship the Guerrero in 1812. One of the kind of seminal moments that we have is our Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem. The British actually tried to invade Baltimore, but they're actually blocked at the harbor by Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry holds out against this bombardment, and one of the guys, Americans, who'd actually been taken prisoner on a British ship was Francis Scott Key, who composes this poem that will later become the Star Spangled Banner. And it actually won't become our national anthem until the 1930s. For quite a while in U.S. history, until the 1930s, we had about 3 different songs that kind of competed for the national anthem. One was A Star Spangled Banner, the other was My Country 'Tis of Thee, and the other was Hail Columbia. In my personal opinion, I think My Country 'Tis of Thee would have been a better national anthem. But that's my opinion. What we see is by 1813, Tecumseh himself is actually killed near Detroit at the Battle of the Thames by forces under William Henry Harrison. And a guy little known, but who's going to make himself extremely famous out of this war, Andrew Jackson, actually defeats the Creeks, or the Red Sticks, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. From this, Andrew Jackson marches immediately to the port of New Orleans because word has actually reached him that the British are trying to take New Orleans. If they take New Orleans, they can bottle up the entire Mississippi River. So Jackson goes there, and what we see is this is really the greatest victory America has out of this war. Andrew Jackson scrapes up as many men as he can from the streets of New Orleans. Some are slaves, pirates, effete kind of dandies, you name it. They give a gun to these people, promise them good wages, and they stop this British invasion force of 7,500 men. It's an overwhelming victory for the United States. But the irony is, this battle is actually fought 2 weeks after peace is declared at the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. So, what does this treaty really do? The treaty pretty much restores everything to the way that it had been before the war. There was no apology for or by Great Britain for taking our sailors, no territory exchanged hands. Everything went back to the way that it was. So for America, this is really as best as it could get. Remember what we said about the restrictions and kind of handicaps the United States had in fighting this war. One of the kind of curious things that we saw out of this is, like the Revolutionary War, thousands of slaves escaped to British lines. And of course, the U.S. wants them back. Great Britain refuses to do so. And what we see is, after a few years, it's actually kind of left up to an international kind of, I don't want to say trial, but international kind of settlement being settled by the Tsar of Russia, who really rules in favor of the United States. So Great Britain does pay some money for these slaves, but they don't get the slaves back, and these slaves settle as free men in Canada. So what's the immediate aftereffects of the war? A lot of contemporaries from the time called this the Second War of Independence. I don't know about that. But what we really see out of this, it really confirms the ability of our republic to keep the government going and conducting a war without surrendering its institutions. So, the British did capture Washington, D.C., but we didn't give up, and the government of the United States didn't collapse. What we also already see is it really completed the conquest of the area east of the Mississippi River, started since the Revolution. And those Indian tribes that had been out in the areas before the War of 1812 in the Northwest and the South, they're pretty much broken people. So for international relations, what it means for us is, after this war with Napoleon, there's pretty much almost a century of peace in Europe, in which we kind of disengage from Europe, in a sense. We're not too concerned about what's going on outside the borders of the United States. We're mainly focused inward now. And we're going to see this in the coming lecture when we talk about the market revolution. So another thing I kind of mentioned at the first lecture is the war also strengthened Canadian nationalism. For the Canadians, this War of 1812 and driving out the foreign invader, the United States, again, strengthens their nationalism. And this is, again, part of their kind of national creation myth that they love to talk about and celebrate. one of the things that the War of 1812 does is it pretty much puts the death knell in for the Federalist Party. Before the war, Jefferson and Madison had almost completely succeeded in eliminating the Federalist Party. And in 1812, Madison barely wins over the Federalist candidate DeWitt Clinton from New York. However, by 1814, New England and its Federalists really gather up in Hartford, Connecticut, because during this war, it's really at a time when the Federalists kind of reach their peak. It looks like they're coming back because of the dissatisfaction with this war. And what they're complaining about is, the federal government is in the South. It's been dominated with all these presidents except one, John Adams. They've all been from pretty much Virginia in the South. And what they're complaining about is what we kind of talked about in the last chapter. With more states coming into the Union, the land out west, it's slowly kind of watering down their own power within the United States. So what we see is this gathering of these Federalists in Hartford, Connecticut. They're talking about ending the 3/5 clause, which gives the southern states more representation in the houses of Congress than what they would normally have. So again, the Federalists are at their kind of peak of coming back to power, and then all of a sudden, the word received from them, or to them, I should say, is that Andrew Jackson is victorious in the Battle of New Orleans. And after this, the Federalist Party completely falls apart. They're seen as being disloyal. They didn't have patriotism. They weren't backing the United States. And so within a few years, they kind of continue on here and there, and then they completely disappear. They're gone like the dinosaurs. So what we saw was really in an expanding agricultural nation, the urban, commercial, and financial interest was representing a minority. And their elitism and the distrust of popular self-government put them more and more at odds with the nation. So again, it was a party that kind of outlived its time, and the War of 1812 puts the death knell in for them. All right, ladies, that's the end of part 1. Join me again for part 2. Again, it's a 4-part lecture series, and I'll get that out as soon as possible. Thanks, and have a good day.